here. Before I introduce our speaker for this evening, can I just refer you to the piece of paper on your seat, which gives some details of our courses here, particularly the degree course in ancient history and the Access Humanities course, which is English, history and philosophy. If that's of interest to you or anybody else that you know, please contact us on the email addresses on the sheet. That's me, Dr. Joy Starter, and my colleague, Dr. Virginia Garrity. But without any further ado, I would like to introduce you to Professor Mark Bailey from the University of East Anglia. Mark is a celebrated medieval historian, and I have to say, has also played rugby for England. This evening, he's going to take us on a fascinating journey through all the reverberations around the Black Death in late medieval England. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Ooh, yes, I might ask you after 10 minutes, do you want to still hear me once you've heard what it's about? By the way, I did play cricket for Bury St Edmunds as well. It should have, even better, even better. Now, I can't imagine for one moment on a cold, wet February night in Bury St Edmunds what brings you in wanting to hear about a subject as deeply depressing as this. Except I'll try and persuade you that not only is it interesting, but perhaps not quite as depressing as you might imagine. But we can start off with the downside. The Black Death of 1348-49, without question, is the greatest catastrophe in documented human history, bar none. Half of the population of the world, known world, died in the course of a 6 or 7 year period. So that'll tell us something about the way in which institutions, humans, respond to catastrophe. And there's a growing interest in catastrophe studies. Secondly, if you want to study the Black Death and know about it, you have to really know a good deal about a whole range of different subjects. Interdisciplinary. You've got to know a bit about epidemiology, history, theology, philosophy, sociology, and so on. It is truly an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary subject. And in that sense, it captures the joy and the fascination of history, which is the ultimate interdisciplinary subject. Third reason for perhaps studying the Black Death is what if history. Actually, I don't normally bother with what if history. It's great on the History Channel or on Channel 5 after the watershed, but actually trying to reconstruct what happened in England in the middle of the 14th century is hard enough, let alone trying to understand why it happened without bothering to wonder what would have happened if it hadn't rolled up. But I did go to one conference in 2010 where an Icelandic historian called Kierkegaard said that if the Black Death hadn't struck northwestern Europe in the 1340s, there is no doubt that the Americas would have been discovered by Scandinavians probably sometime towards the end of the 14th century because of massive population pressure in Europe causing migrations looking at cultivable lands. As it happens, the Black Death strikes and the Americas are discovered by the Spaniards towards the end of the 15th century. In some senses, therefore, perhaps changing the course of history. Another reason for perhaps studying this subject is that it also captures the way in which history changes. I gave a lecture on this subject about 2 years ago here, and what I'm saying tonight is actually going to be really rather different to what I was saying 2 years ago, and very different to the way that I lectured to undergraduates on this subject 20 years ago, because advances in science and in historical method in the last 20 years, and suddenly an almost tsunami of interest in the Black Death amongst a range of different scholars from all over the world has fundamentally changed the way in which we look at it and what we know about this topic, which indicates that history is always changing. The subject might be fixed, but the way in which we approach it and what we understand about it is constantly changing. One more reason: the pathogen that caused this disease in the middle of the 1340s is still present and still active on 5 of the 7 continents of the world. And in a world without antibiotics, or where antibiotics are increasingly ineffective in dealing with infection and bacilli, this is the disease to watch. It first came around in the middle of the first millennium, and it keeps coming back. It probably represents the greatest single threat to humanity left unchecked. Do you want to go on? No, it's fine. Right. I mean, one of the things that interests historians is whether the Black Death is a turning point. If you want to get in your time machine and go back to any period of history, or if you want to study history, I'd go to the 14th century, which is one of the most calamitous in human history. There are 4 one-in-a-millennia events occur in England in the 14th century, of which the Black Death is one. And it's regarded as a turning point. The moment when, after 2 centuries of benign climate, economic growth, demographic growth in the 12th and 13th centuries, suddenly all that changed. A great cycle of European efflorescence turned with the 14th century and went into 2-3 centuries of decline, of decay, of population contraction, and therefore it's an event of some real significance. There is, however, a debate amongst historians as to the role of the Black Death in all of this. Was there a bigger crisis within European society, or is the Black Death solely to blame? There are some historians, in fact most in the 20th century, relentlessly downplayed the importance of the Black Death. They said that it merely accelerated trends already in motion and is easy to overestimate. And indeed, as recently as 2016, Gregory Clark has argued that the Black Death was an inconsequential blip on the road to modernity. In the last 20 years, though, historians and econometricians from across the globe are suddenly interested in the Black Death because it is now regarded by the majority of people as the turning point in the route way of humanity to modernity, the most important transitional period in European economic history. And the argument is that there are 2 ways to modernity. And for modernity, it's the society we live in, high productivity, high incomes, the last 2 centuries of humanity's existence on the planet. And there are 2 route ways to it. One is through evolution. Northwest Europe and England in general becomes the first industrial nation. Or through state socialism and revolution, Eastern Europe in the late 19th and 20th century. And it's argued that the route way, the sort of fork in the road to modernity occurs at the time of the Black Death. So there's much, much more interest in it because people argue that this catastrophe, this crisis, actually led to the society that we now live in. And hence you can see the significant interest in the subject. The interest in England is particularly high for 2 reasons. One, this is the first industrial nation, and therefore England's route way from the middle of the 14th century to the 18th and 19th century has global significance. But secondly, we are extraordinarily fortunate with the quality and the quantity of sources that allow us to reconstruct what on earth happened in the middle of the 14th century. The local sources in England are without parallel anywhere in the world. Just needs people to learn how to read them and go off and use them. Bury St Edmund's Record Office is chock-a-block with medieval sources from the 14th century that have hardly been looked at. So there's still plenty of work to be done. I'll give you two examples here. One is Eastern Bavent, Southwold to Londoners. It's been washed away just north of Southwold, and this is the heading of a manorial account. You might not be able to see it. I'm going to bellow, but here is the normal heading to the account, and somebody has written, you might see just the word, Pestilentia hominem regnavit in Angliae. The scribe has just added the year when the pestilence of humanity reigned throughout England. Just a little sense of what happened. On the right-hand side, a court roll from Walsham-le-Willows in 1361, and all it records is death, 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 death of land tenants. It's the second Great Plague epidemic of 1361. And from these sources, we have a really rich basis for reconstructing what on earth happened. And it's easy to lose sight of the human tragedy and the terror and the pain that people must have sensed as this disease approached. And they knew that it was coming. You occasionally get a glimpse of it. Here's a court roll for Redgrave in Suffolk. The first entry, May 1349. It's in Latin, but it actually says that Roger le Rive died holding 16 acres of land and hands the 16 acres onto his 4 sons, who are named, who survived. Wonderful. July court, 3 of the boys died, leaving just 1 heir. So from a family of 6, Roger Louis had just 1 heir. Ray Lott worked out that in Walsham-le-Willows, whole families were wiped out by this disease in some cases. The disease known as the Black Death spreads. It almost certainly is a 13th century disease in China, Western China or Tibet. It comes to Europe in 1347. The blue, for those of you who know your geography, because I can't point to 3 screens simultaneously, you can see the blue, I hope, and that is where it's first recorded in what is known as modern Kazakhstan in 1346. The green is 1347, and you'll know the Balearic Islands, you'll know the Rhone Delta. It's reached there in 1347. You might even see that it's reached Genoa and Venice. It's jumping, and actually it's travelling thousands of kilometres. Then next colour is the sort of beige, 1348, purple 1349, yellow 1350, orange 1351. The 2 things to notice from that spread are, firstly, how fast it bounds, and it bounds clockwise westwards through Europe, then up into northern Europe and east again. And those of you who are sharp-eyed will see that from its epicenter in Kazakhstan, it moves very, very slowly northwards and stops. And it stops because that is the impermeable political barrier between the Russian and the Mongol empires, which tells you that we are spreading this disease. This, without question, is a disease of humans. And you can see in 1347, it is Italian city-state trading ships that are taking it throughout Europe. And it comes to England from Bordeaux. So we are transporting this disease. We can even recreate its spread in Suffolk through a combination of the appointment of priests and records of deaths first occurring in court rolls. And I stopped the research in May 1349 to try and get a snapshot of how it's getting in and how it's spreading in Suffolk. And you can see, I hope, that it's going in through the Store, through the Deben, and it's even going in through the Waveney Valley. And there's also a wonderful set of data that shows it going up the A140 very slowly during the course of the summer of 1349. It's the arterial routeways, it's humans that are transporting this. And this is spreading in Suffolk in January and February 1349. It's spreading throughout the winter, not just in the summer. We know then that it spreads during the first 6 months of 1349. It moves rapidly. Once it's into a community, it spends 3 months there. There are multiple points of entry. People are getting infected, and it's 3 weeks before we suspect their infection becomes evident, redolent of the coronavirus, and a high geographical coverage. I have been looking for 30 years to see if there is a single place which was not hit by this disease. I actually found it in the Borough Record Office 4 years ago. Hargrave completely missed out in 1349, and I have no idea why. But don't worry, when 1361 came along, it was heavily hit. About 25% of the population died. But that's the only example that I've found. And about 50 to 60% of the population died. Symptoms, well, we don't know because there aren't any English symptoms that are contemporary. There are a couple of strong eyewitness accounts from Flanders and France, and they describe the classic symptoms of bubonic and pneumonic plague. The buboes in the lymph nodes, or the sneezing and rapid death. Bubonic pneumonic plague. It's still around. This is a picture of somebody who went hiking in Colorado 2 years ago and stayed out for 4 weeks and was bitten. Bitten firstly by the neck, hence the bubo, as you can see. And you can see the hand. That is necrosis. That is just the death of tissue, and that's where you get the black death from. This person, they got antibiotics into her very quickly, and she survived. But if you don't get antibiotics into you, you've got a 30% chance of surviving. In the late 20th century, there's a huge debate about what this disease was, because in some ways, the Black Death is behaving very differently to the known and observed epidemiology of pneumonic and bubonic plague in the 20th century, which it tends to be a disease of rats, and it tends to move in the summer. This disease is a disease of humans, the Black Death, and it's transmitted throughout the year. And historians, basically for 20 years, if you studied the Black Death at university, there would have been a question in your exam on, was the Black Death plague or wasn't it? But after 2011, nobody sets that question anymore. And that is because DNA technology has definitively identified the offending pathogen. Basically, from profiles in dental pulp, they have been able, from 8 different burial sites across Europe, they have identified Y. pestis, Yersinia pestis. It was plague. The Black Death was definitively plague, but the strain is quite unlike any modern strain. So it's the Black Death behaving differently to modern plague, and it clearly was transmitted by humans, whereas the modern plague is much more a disease of mammals in general and rats in particular. So it was behaving differently. We now have a new epidemiology of medieval plague. It occurred in China in the 13th century, and they reckon that there were 2 separate strains of Y. pestis that got into one living organism, probably something like a gerbil or a marmot, something like that, simultaneously. The gerbil stayed alive long enough for the 2 strains to fuse, and then for the gerbil to spread it to somebody else. So just imagine the chance of that happening, the random nature. The consequence is that 2 different strains of Y. pestis come together and explode. It's a much, much more virulent form and takes hold in the human population, not just the mammal population. And it probably is spread by human fleas or even lice. as well. So their multiple vectors probably doesn't have to be pneumonic plague. It was probably just bubonic plague, but much more infectious and being passed from person to person. But what we get, therefore, the climate was changing as well, and the climate was just right for the replication of mammals and the lice and the fleas, and it's a sort of a perfect ecological storm. A whole load of random events come together. Well, how else would you explain the most catastrophic event in human history, except through a succession of chance events? Once it's arrived, kills 50% of the population in 1349, it does not go away. In fact, the last outbreak, as all school children know, was in England in 1665, Marseille in 1722. So it remains in Europe for the next 3 centuries, and it occurs frequently. The second epidemic in 1361, 1362 kills between 10 to 15% of the population, and hardly anybody has written about it. The second greatest health catastrophe of the last millennium, and hardly anybody writes about it because of the one that happened 14 years earlier. But it's a significant event. 1369, 1373, 1390, 14 times in the 15th century it comes back. It gets less virulent, the spread is less complete in the later epidemics, but it keeps coming back. And as a consequence, English population, as you can see, remains low. It was maybe 5.5, 6 million people in England on the eve of the Black Death. England's population does not recover till the 18th century. This sets in motion the most sustained period of demographic contraction in documented human history. And it has a significant impact on a whole load of different aspects of human life. We're only just beginning to understand what it must have been like to live through. Most historians have written about 1348, 49, and then it went away and then it came back in 1361. Actually, it triggers a crisis lasting 5 years. It's not until 1353 that you get a sense that society is beginning to just pick itself up off its knees from this catastrophic blow. 40% of all landed property changes hands in this 5 years. It's the single biggest land transfer in documented history. People normally talk about after the World War I significant shift in land ownership. Nothing compared to this. The loss of human capital, people who do brass robbing say there aren't any from the 1350s and the 1360s. There are no big cathedral projects completed in the 1350s and 1360s because there's a shortage of skilled workers. But most remarkably of all, the harvest in 1349 fails. Well, not surprising. People are dying of plague and they don't get it in. It rots in the field. That's fine. 1350, it fails catastrophically. 1351, it fails again. 1352, it fails again. Not in recorded history has there been 4 catastrophic in a row harvest failures. Something remarkable is happening with the climate and the weather at this time. And in particular, salt prices rise 7-fold. Now, so what? It's a bit difficult to get hold of salt, except it's made by people, so it might reflect shortage of labour. No. First and foremost, it reflects a lack of solar activity. There's a nuclear for 4 years. The plague coincides with an extremely cold, dark and wet period where grain is not growing particularly well. Come back to that in just a moment. What does the government do? Well, many historians regard the Black Death as the moment when governments, for the first time, recognised that they had a significant role to play in the formulation and implementation of social policy, intervening in markets in order to protect the welfare of the mass of the populace. And they had a notion of the common good. The whole point of government was to uphold the common good of society. And that meant that its interdependent parts should perform their function and role. What's the role of the lower orders of society? To labour cheaply for the knights and for the monastic and ecclesiastical community. But they're in hugely short supply. And as a consequence, the government, as plague is raging, in June 1349 passes the Ordinance of Labourers, and as soon as Parliament next meets in February 1351, they pass the Statutes of Labourers, which set a maximum wage, not a minimum wage, a maximum wage, and forces the able to work when required to do so. There's a compulsory service clause. In other words, is to try to force the lower orders of society to stand to their duties to work cheaply for the ruling elite. Now this is wholly contrary to what we would understand as proper forces of supply and demand in the labour market. If you're in short supply, you're valuable, wages go up, good for you. No, that was contrary to the common good. At the same time, there is inflation, dramatic inflation, which is not quite what you expect because essentially demand has collapsed because of the loss of half the population. But foodstuff prices jump up. And so the government intervenes to try to fix the prices of things like bread and ale at affordable prices and to clamp down on profiteering. So there is a huge outburst of legislative activity by the government in areas where it has scarcely legislated before, because it's suddenly seen a role for itself. And historians say this is the start of governments recognising that they have responsibilities and the power to intervene in markets through legislation in order to support the welfare of the majority of people. In order to enforce this labour and price legislation, they introduce a new form of justice, the justice of labourer, who becomes the justice of the peace in the 1360s. And we know them as magistrates and magistrates' courts. So actually, one of the great institutions of Great Britain, the magistrates' courts, quarterly assizes, begin in direct response to the Black Death. Scientists now reckon that the Black Death is also associated with significant climate change. And what appears to happen is that a period of benign climate in the 12th and 13th century suddenly ends around the 1280s, and you get, over the next 100 years, a succession of highly volatile, turbulent, and significant variations in the weather, including storm activity. Those of you who've been to Dunwich, it disappeared between 1280 and 1340. And we now realise that something very, very strange was happening to the climate. There's a huge increase in storm activity. So it is a symptom of this dramatic climatic change, as indeed as those 4 back-to-back harvest failures. 1352 is the coldest single event recorded in the whole of the last 2 millennia in Greenland. And historians now reckon that this is the start of the Little Ice Age. Highly volatile weather. Now, does that mean that the Black Death is associated with coldness or highly volatile weather? Well, research into the Justinian plague of the 530s has also shown that there was nuclear winter then as well. Nobody is attributing causation to these events, but what there clearly is a strong correlation. Other things are in play as well, but the more unstable and volatile the climate, it seems to be linked to pathogenic volatility and perhaps mutation. We can't say beyond that. But what this shows is the world climate reconstructed from a range of sources, and you can see in the middle of the 14th century there, right in the middle of the graph, the cold event in Greenland, and you can see the climate over the course of the 15th century cooling dramatically. And in fact, climatologists argue that our modern climate system with the trade winds and El Nino probably dates from the 15th century. The climatic system of the world was very different before that point, so there is a significant tipping point taking place, of which the Black Death is just part of a highly complex and at the moment poorly understood mix. So just to finish off for sort of 10-15 minutes or so to talk about the sort of longer term impact. And you can look at this topic in one of two ways. Depends whether your pot is permanently half full or half empty. Depends upon the colour of the inside of your head, because historians view it in different ways. And actually, you can view it both ways, which either makes the later Middle Ages the most confusing and unpleasant thing you would wish to study, or, like me, it makes it the most fascinating period in human history. On the one hand, with the colour black on the inside of their head, are those who argue that this was a disaster. It prompts economic recession lasting 150 years. It creates social instability and unrest. Culturally, it triggers a century of pessimism and lassitude. The British do lassitude pretty well, but they layered pessimism right on top of that. And that there was a morbid obsession with death. In the blue corner, or the yellow corner, smiling in the sunlight, are those who say, hang on, this is an opportunity. And there were significant structural changes in the economy and society and in culture that set the first steps towards modernity. The institutional changes that take place in the 100, 200 years after the Black Death move Northwest Europe in particular towards the Industrial Revolution and modernity. So you can blame the Black Death or be grateful to the Black Death for that. Economic recession, it's easy to argue. This is a picture of a deserted village. Until the 1950s, historians didn't admit that the villages could be deserted. This one disappeared during the late 14th and early 15th century in Warwickshire, and nobody. It was a full village just before the Black Death. By the middle of the 15th century, there's nobody living there, and you can see the outline of the village houses, the ridge and furrow of the old arable, perfectly preserved in this pasture. GDP, so the size of the economy, falls about 30-40% between 1350 and 1450. Agriculture goes into a massive slump because prices eventually fall, wages are high, you can't make any profits. So you can see the contraction in the economy, fewer people, and contraction in profits. 40% of all markets and fairs which have been founded in the 13th century disappear between 1350 and 1500. So you can see it's a much smaller economy, not surprisingly. Pessimism and lassitude, this is a wonderful example of a cadaver on a tomb. On top, of course, is the John Barrett's one of the best examples in St Mary's Church. On the top, this is me and my finery, but down below is the reminder of how I am now. It is a mortality reminder. Death is all around us. Prepare for death. A sense that there is an obsession with morality. Why did this come along? God's angry. God is punishing us. Oh, therefore, let's look in the mirror. There must be sinfulness all around us. And a sense that divine anger is the cause of this pestilence. Therefore, there is an obsession with sin and morality. It's no coincidence that three of the greatest poets in English history, Gower, Langland and Chaucer, are writing in the 1370s, 80s and 90s, because they are trying to make sense of this extraordinary change, its implications for society, its implications for belief systems, and its implications for social structure. And they're dealing with the types of issues that contemporaries were grappling with. It's also argued that there are no great intellectual or scientific breakthroughs in the late 14th and 15th century. because humankind was overcome with a sense of pessimism and lassitude. What's the point? We've been punished. What's the point? And that this is a symptom of a society that's just languishing for 100 years as a consequence of this. And the iconography of the period is wonderful. The one on the left is the Dance of Death, a French notion from the late 14th century. The idea that these diseases, they keep coming back, but when are they going to come? Are they going to get you? Are you going to survive? Are you going to get your children or not? The unpredictability, but also that death is somehow toying with us, and we're dancing to its tune, hence the Dance of Death. But the cadavers are there to remind people to prepare in this life for the inevitability of death. It's a warning as much as something to frighten them. Best of the lot, late 15th century, Hieronymus Bosch painting in Flanders, the Last Judgment. Early 14th century Last Judgment. Heaven is full of order and dominates the landscape. Look at Bosch's Last Judgment. Heaven is virtually empty at the top there. I think Christ is looking at God saying, what's going on? And down below you can see the punishments of mankind in purgatory for sinfulness. This sense of sin, of morality and an obsession, and the punishments and the torments of purgatory. So do things that will reduce your time in purgatory. Have a good life, prepare a good death, so that you reduce the time in purgatory. If you don't, look what's awaiting you. And if you ever get a chance to look closely at a Bosch picture, do. Because the punishments are painful, very physical, and are directly related to one's sinfulness. Whatever your sin was, it's related to it. I spent 30 minutes lost in front of that at the Prado, and eventually a couple of security guards came along and moved me along. They clearly thought I was about to do the picture of myself some damage, but utterly captivating. Right, in the yellow corner, some historians argue that actually, after the Black Death, we get for the first time in Northwest Europe the birth of consumerism. And the reason is that the labour legislation didn't really work, and as a consequence, the lower orders of society have more wealth. There is a redistribution of wealth down towards them because their labour's scarce, land is cheap and available. And as a consequence, people consume more. First thing they buy, ale. And then what do they buy after that? More ale. And the reason is it's a safe source of carbohydrate and fluid. So there's a huge increase in the consumption of ale per capita. It's also argued that the age of carnivorous Europe starts after the Black Death, because ordinary people have the money to buy cheese, dairy produce, meat, whereas before the Black Death they could only afford some kind of gruel or porridge. So they're eating better. They're also dressing better as well. And you want to know why Hadley, Long Melford, Lavenham are suddenly expanding despite the death rate around them? They're growing after the Black Death. The answer is that they're making cheap textiles which are in demand from the survivors, who now have more money to spend, and they want half-decent textiles and blankets in order to keep them warm. Why do they want to keep warm? Because we now know it's a really cold period. They're also building sturdier houses as well. The famous example from Lavenham of a late 14th century house. Hardly any peasant houses survive from the 13th century because they're hovels. The ones built after the Black Death are built to higher standards by professionals, as you can see. It's also argued it's a golden age of individualism. You want to get on in life? Here's the great opportunity to acquire land, to find work and do well. One such example, Sir John de Wingfield from Wingfield in Suffolk in the 1350s. He fought with the Black Prince and made so much money in the 1350s that he ended up rebuilding Wingfield Church basically as a monument to himself and founding Wingfield College in the north of Suffolk. It's also argued this was the liberation of women, because work is available, there's a shortage of workers, so women get drawn into the labour market. They then choose to delay marriage. And it's argued that the consequence of women working more and delaying age at first marriage, and in some cases choosing not to marry, has an adverse effect on fertility rates. It causes the birth rate of England to contract. And that is assumed to explain why the population took so long to recover, and we're going towards modernity. You're creating the nuclear household of fertility restriction, and you are defending wealth. And that this is a particular feature, it's called the Northwest European marriage pattern, a particular feature of Northwest Europe. So it's basically giving ordinary people more and more wealth, and they're spending it on consumer goods, and it's generating a different economy and society than in other parts of Europe. And this is a graph. It's a graph. I thought I'd just slip it in. There've been lots of pictures, pie charts and so on. It's a graph. What it shows is how output per person just jumps after the red line of the Black Death and stays high. It shows that ordinary people are wealthy. So GDP, the economy contracts by 30%, but wealth per head goes up by something like 25% over the course of the late 14th century. And that's the basis of this sector and consumer boom in the late 14th century. It's also been argued that although there were no major scientific breakthroughs, there was an information revolution. And in some sense, there's a huge growth in demand for calendars and astrological predictions, because people want to know when's the next plague coming. How do I not catch plague? So actually, pamphlets describing prophylactic measures you can take to escape catching the disease. And as a consequence, there is a huge increase in demand for writing. And it's that stimulates the development of the printing press in the middle of the 15th century, because they can't meet the demand for information. Quarantining, from the Latin meaning 40 days, begins in the late 14th century in Italy, and they take public health measures that help to prevent the spread of this disease. And one historian has argued that the success of the public health authorities in trying to control disease in the 15th century and particularly in Italy, is the source of the Renaissance. A sense that humans actually, despite the divine anger, despite the ravages of these diseases from God, that humans can influence and direct their own future. And that gives rise to an optimism that underpins the Renaissance and the growth of humanism at the end of the 15th and 16th century. But at the same time, contemporaries were very, very well aware of the wheel of fortune. That you might be getting lucky, but if a next disease comes along and kills you off, or you build everything up and you have no heirs because they've all been killed in disease, you've got this wonderful farm, it has nowhere to go. They were very aware of the wheel of fortune, what goes up, what can go down. So even though there might be opportunity, even though there might be cause for optimism, there's a fear about instability, and there's a fear about losses that might be just around the corner. One more graph, I'll get away with it. The red, what's worth showing about this? Yeah, the red are wages in Northwest European cities between about 1200 and 1800. And the dark is wages in Central and Southern European cities. And we can all read the graph. What it shows is that Northwest Europe wages begin to move ahead in about the 15th century. And this is one of the indices of the little divergence, the move towards modernity, greater wealth and output per head in northwest Europe, including England. Mainly Holland to start off with, but including England. So the gap is beginning to open up. And what's interesting about this is that you've got the same biological shock throughout the whole of Europe. Same shock, different outcomes. Societies are responding differently. Not much change in Central and Southern Europe, still feudalism, still serfdom. It's actually disappearing in Northwest Europe. And as a consequence, labour, land, commodity and capital markets are beginning to grow. The growth of modernity. They begin to grow because serfdom has disappeared and dissolved. And this is sort of the big issue. Econometricians across the world are now flooding into the 14th century. They don't know the history, they don't read any medieval history, but they have mathematical models and they are looking to try and understand when this divergence took place, when the key elements of it began, because that, for them, is the origins of modern society. And it goes back to the age of the Black Death. That's dull. So I'll move on to the conclusion. It's an age of contrasts and contradictions, as I hope to have sketched for you. As I've also suggested, you'll either find that deeply, deeply frustrating, or you'll find it utterly fascinating. That there are clear examples of people who simply could not cope with the emotional and psychological trauma of losing loved ones and living through this. There are others who seized the opportunity to acquire land and set themselves up on a new route way, a new opportunity, and all without the help of any counselling. The only counselling service would have been the church and support from family. It does emphasise the centrality of human response of individuals, but also of different societies whose institutional arrangements were subtly different. And that's why you get very different responses both at the personal level and at the societal level throughout Europe to the challenge and the catastrophe of the Black Death. But it does seem that in Western Europe it sets a number of institutional changes that help to increase productivity. And this is the most frightening thing. The Black Death probably is the origin of modernity, and we're terrified about the coronavirus, we're terrified about overpopulation. Actually, 60-70% reduction in the world's population in the next 20 years might be the paradigm shift that humanity needs to survive. Okay, I'm making that up. All right, I'm making it up. And who wants to be the 70%? Or who wants to be the 30%? The lesson from the Black Death is that this crisis was an opportunity, one that changed the course of human history. It's also implying links between climate and pathogenic change. I've emphasised they're correlated. We don't know what the causal link is, but there is a clear correlation between a highly volatile climate, an unstable climate, and increased pathogenic activity and mutation. And we are, without question, going into a phase of more volatile and unstable world climate. It probably helps to explain the rise of the West, as I've said, but I hope it also gives you a sense of the discipline of history. Extraordinarily eclectic, extraordinarily complex, and ever-changing. It does not stand still. Stuff that I've talked about this evening, I've only been reading from publications in the last year, 18 months. We're constantly revisiting, and there is a mass of evidence just across at Bury St Edmunds, in the National Archives, a mass of evidence about the 14th century, unparalleled anywhere else in the world, just waiting to be uncovered so we can understand better actually how ordinary people responded to the Black Death. Because the cumulative efforts of lots of individual people explain the big, long-term, major societal responses that I've been describing. Thank you.
it's quite chilling at the end, wasn't it? But we have got about 10 minutes for questions. Can I ask you, if you have a question, just so that everybody can hear it, if you would mind standing up and delivering your question? Any questions?
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm interested in your views a bit more possibly on the correlation between